What if I told you that the brake failure that almost takes Hamilton from the track in Singapore was only the consequence of a defect that Ferrari dragged from the beginning of the season, and that his personal engineer confirmed that Hamilton was driving practically without brakes for more than half a career? Today I am going to tell you the story that Ferrari tried to silence. When the race began, Hamilton made a clean start, without shocks, fast, methodical, drawing each curve as if it had something to demonstrate. But from the first laps, the sensations he transmitted on radio were not those of a comfortable pilot. Comments such as, "The brakes feel weird," "I lose your butt in long braking," or "I can't balance the car in slow curve," appeared in the first 30 turns. Telemetry confirmed what Lewis felt, an irregular response of the brake system, especially on the front axle. But the most serious had not arrived yet. It was on Vuelta 60 when the drama exploded. Hamilton's voice, tense but controlled, broke into the radio, "Losing my brakes, companion." That message ignited all alarms. The engineer Riccardo Adami immediately asked him to activate the lift and coast technique, which consists of lifting the throttle foot long before the braking point to avoid demanding too much to the system. But it was late. The SF-25 had crossed a critical internal temperature threshold. The left front brake had not only stopped working properly, but was structurally compromised. Lewis confirmed seconds later, "I lost my brakes, I lost my left striker." At that point, he was literally handling on the verge of abandonment. But what came later was even more impressive. Despite the critical situation, Hamilton kept the car on the track, adapting its curved pilot. There was no margin of error. The electronic braking system had entered a state of protection due to overheating, which caused intermittent loss of hydraulic pressure. That is, in each braking, Hamilton did not know exactly how much braking power he was going to have. Even so, he continued in the race, fighting for positions, minimizing damage. It was then that Adami warned him of the track limits, seeing that his paths were increasingly open. And Hamilton, in a firm but frustrated voice, replied, "I'm not trying to cut the course, companion." That phrase was not a simple defense. It was an undercover accusation, a scream of technical aid. He was not crossing the limits by his own decision, but because the car did not give him another option. It was that or ending against the wall. And to finish the drama, when the possibility of a sanction was mentioned, Hamilton closed the conversation with a comment that marked the post-carrier tone: "Force majeure." What I was saying was simple. If they penalize me for this, they are ignoring that the car was broken. What seemed a complicated night in Marina Bay ended up becoming the trigger for one of the most serious internal investigations that Ferrari has executed in recent years. Frédéric Vasseur, team director, understood that what Hamilton lived was not an isolated incident or a simple technical chance. The way in which the brake system failed not suddenly, but progressive and cumulative revealed a failure that went beyond component wear or poor thermal management during the race. Vasseur did not need a prolonged meeting to make a decision. Just a few hours after the end of the Grand Prix, he ordered a complete technical audit of the SF-25 centered on the brake-by-wire system and the integration of the MGUK. What the engineers found was alarming. First, the telemetry data collected from free practices to the race showed a clear pattern, an accumulation of thermal stress that intensified with each stint. This should not happen. The brake-by-wire system, which is responsible for electronically managing the distribution of braking between hydraulic brakes and the electric recovery motor, had been operating on the superior margins of its thermal tolerance during almost the whole weekend. The most worrying thing was not that. It was that this situation had been repeated in the Great Prizes, although to a lesser extent and without being made public. In other words, the defect already existed. Only Singapore, with its low speed, low natural ventilation and extreme braking requirements, was the break point. Ferrari's investigation identified that the main cause of the ruling was in the SF-25 architecture itself. In the eagerness to optimize the aerodynamic flow of the key soil in the current era of soil effect, the engineers of the rampant Cavallino had designed an air channeling system that favored the performance of the flat background, but severely compromised the refrigeration of the brakes, especially the strikers. This design decision, although theoretically efficient in simulators, ended up having disastrous consequences in real conditions, where the heat accumulated without the possibility of dissipating properly. The brake-by-wire, when detecting temperatures higher than the safety threshold, activated a protection protocol that progressively reduced the assistance of the hydraulic system. That is, the pilot began to lose braking capacity in a gradual but constant way. In that state, the car becomes unpredictable. The required braking pressure varies with each curve. It is not just about stopping earlier or softer, but not knowing how much real power it will have every time the pedal is sought. This is a nightmare for any Formula One pilot. The internal report, to which high-ranking engineers had access to Maranello, confirmed that Lewis Hamilton had had to adapt its return pilot, curve, according to the level of response of the system. This additional effort, in addition to expansion at the physical and mental level, had a direct impact on its performance. There was no room to attack, just survive. But there did not end the problem. Vasseur, far from complying with the explanations of the technical department, requested a complete review of the energy recovery system. The connection between the MGUK and the regenerative brake system showed charging inconsistencies in certain circuit sections, which caused an imbalance in the delivery of energy during braking. To this was added a calibration software that did not respond properly to extreme scenarios, which generated discouragements between mechanical and electric braking. It was like having two brains that tried to stop the car, but they didn't communicate with each other. Now that the truth had come to light, Ferrari faced his greatest challenge: redesign in record time a critical system for the car, without losing competitiveness, without skipping the budget limits, and without their rivals detecting the real severity of the problem. One of the first disturbing findings was the non-linear deformation of the SF-25 soil. In theory, the floor of a Formula One car must be kept rigid under load to allow the air flow under the car to generate the maximum soil effect, a fundamental basis of current aerodynamic performance. But in the case of SF-25, previous structural simulations did not correctly anticipate the real behavior of the car on the track. Under certain lateral and vertical load conditions, the ground was irregularly flexed, completely altering the air flow pattern to the diffuser and the flat bottom. This unpredictable soil deformation caused an intermittent loss of the so-called stable plane, an essential condition for the car to maintain predictable behavior in rapid curves and direction changes. When this plane breaks, the car goes from being a solid aerodynamic block to a structure that literally changes in shape and behavior between curve and curve. The immediate consequence is that the pilot cannot trust the consistency of the car. What works in a quick lap can become unmanageable in the next. The SF-25, in other words, had two personalities, one in a straight line and a completely different one under intense lateral load. The result was a critical disconnection between what the pilot felt and what the car was able to do. For Hamilton, this translated into constant uncertainty when it comes to stop late or enter with decision on medium and high-speed curves. The aerodynamic load varied in real time, and in a sport where the margins are millimeter, this was equivalent to running with a bandage. But the problems did not end with soil aerodynamics. The next focus of concern was the thermal management system of the tires, a critical element in modern performance. Under normal conditions, tires must be maintained within a specific thermal window between 85 and 110 degrees Celsius to offer grip, consistency, and durability. What Ferrari engineers found was that the SF-25 presented an abrupt temperature drop in the compounds just before their classification laps. In seconds, the surface temperature of the tires descended between 5 and 6 degrees, enough to get out of the ideal operating window. This phenomenon was devastating for performance. Hamilton could be in his fast return with the car in his ideal configuration, but if the tire did not offer the expected grip level, the return was ruined. The most serious thing is that this thermal loss was not attributable to piloting style or an incorrect preparation of the tire. It was a direct product of an inefficient energy transfer between chassis, suspension, and rubber. In other words, the car was not able to generate or retain the energy necessary to correctly heat the tires before the key moment. This defect had a double impact. In classification, he condemned Hamilton not to be able to squeeze his full potential in decisive moments. In the race, the narrow operational window made the tires prone to graining and asymmetric degradation, affecting their career rhythm and consistency in long stints. An elite pilot can adapt to imperfect conditions, but not when those conditions constantly change back. Ferrari also detected inconsistencies in the axis load distribution system. In certain phases of acceleration and braking, the balance of the car varied spontaneously, directly affecting the pilot's confidence when applying torque or when entering curves under pressure. These balance alterations, combined with the rest of structural defects, made SF-25 a fundamentally unpredictable car. And in Formula One, unpredictability is a competitive death sentence. Ferrari now faced a technical crossroads: redesign critical parts of the car or continue adjusting an unstable concept that could continue betraying them career after career. And in the meantime, Lewis Hamilton had to continue competing with a machine that did not respond with the reliability that a 7-time world champion needs to win again. The phrase, "I am not trying to cut the course, companion," was much more than a defensive comment. It was an undercover cry of frustration, a plea so that from the wall they understood that I was fighting a car that could no longer control. At that time, it was not about looking for positions or fighting for points, it was about surviving. And that, for a Hamilton-caliber pilot, is a completely humiliating and desperate situation. The situation worsened when the official notification of an investigation came for possible infractions to the track limits. From the wall, Adami tried to keep calm, but the tone on the radio changed. Hamilton knew what was coming, a possible sanction that would displace it even more in the final classification. And that was when he released another phrase full of symbolism: force majeure. In the language of Formula One, that term majeure is rarely mentioned by the pilots in the race. It is a legal expression, used to indicate external circumstances that prevent the fulfillment of a duty. In this case, it meant that he should not be penalized because it was not he who crossed the limits by his own decision, but that it was the car, out of control, which forced him to do so. This detail lit a broader discussion in the paddock and the technical circles of the FIA. Should a mechanical failure be considered as mitigating in cases of track limits? The current regulations do not contemplate exceptions in these cases. A wheel out of the layout, repeated on more than 3 occasions, is equivalent to a warning. If there is recidivism, a standard penalty is applied. There is no space for the context, or to analyze whether the car was driving or not. This normative rigidity generated an immediate debate, fed by subsequent statements of several technical experts and analysts, who assured that what was lived by Hamilton should be reviewed under a more flexible perspective. From Ferrari there were no official statements accusing the FIA. Vasseur preferred to maintain a diplomatic position. But inside doors the outrage was evident. The team understood that its pilot had exposed a risk situation and that, despite this, Hamilton had saved a result. Penalizing it was, in the words of one of the technicians of the team, punish who avoided a tragedy. Hamilton himself, hours after the race, was measured before the media, but did not hide his discomfort. He talked about the difficulty maintaining the concentration when the car does not do what you expect, and added that there was no margin of error or reaction margin. He did not apologize. It was not justified. He only asked to understand that his performance was not a consequence of pilot errors, but of technical limitations that were completely out of their control. Do you think the FIA should review its criteria when a pilot exceeds the track limits for verifiable technical causes? Should an exemption clause be introduced, or a contextual analysis in situations where the car does not respond as it should? Or do you think that maintaining the firm standard, regardless of circumstances, guarantees equal treatment for all teams? Let it know in the comments.